Hello and welcome to Irlam Station. My name is Neil MacArthur and I'm chairman of the Davies Trust, and it's our pleasure to look after Irlam Station. This beautiful Victorian building behind us was built in 1894 but was actually the second station to bear the name of Irlam, as behind the camera the original station once stood, but it had to be demolished when the ship canal moved the railway lines to build higher bridges over the canal and rebuild the building you see today to replace it. A few moments will take you around the station and see some of the splendid architecture and the artefacts that it contains. So we now find ourselves on the platform side of the railway station, and in refurbishing this station it was great to see just how much of it is still original. The roof has been off and less than 5% of timbers were replaced. So most of the timber work you see today is original. The exception to that is some of the fine detail which has had to be replaced as it had been lost over the ages. And the canopy before you is actually a much smaller version but a faithful representation of a canopy of the day. All along the line between Liverpool and Manchester you will find stations built by the Cheshire Lines Committee, almost identical to this. But Irlam Station is fairly unique in that it was built on the Manchester platform, whereas virtually all the other stations have been built on the Liverpool platform. And that's just a function of the moving of the lines by the Ship Canal Company that was described earlier. The station today is operated by the Davies Trust and is run as a small museum. It's a cafe and bistro, and as you'll see has some really interesting artefacts to tell the history of both the rail industry and the industries of Irlam and Cadishead. Well, here we are in what would have once been the waiting room of Irlam Station, and in the winter months a coal fire would have been blazing right in that fireplace behind you. Today the station's been opened up more to make more space to operate as a cafe and a small museum, and there would not have been an upstairs in this part of the station. So behind me is the bar today for the bistro and wine bar, but behind where the kitchen is was once the ticket office and a ticket window where the ticket master would have stood. And as we wander through down what we call the Queen's Road to the coal yard, we'll see a faithful representation of an old carriage which has a rich history along with the soapworks in Irlam and Cadishead. So please follow me down. So before me is a representation of a carriage from an ex-Midland Railway 1890s carriage that was purchased by the soapworks and ran between Irlam Station and the soapworks, carrying the managers and the staff of the soapworks until 1965. There's various displays on the wall that show the train, the Peckett train, and the carriage, which today has been saved and is on display in York Railway Museum. So we go down Queen's Road and we take in the coal yard. We're now in a room that we call the coal yard. The reason is that this particular part of the building was actually a coal yard or coal bunker, and it's had slight modifications to make it the room we see today. But the interesting thing about this room is it depicts the histories that we've been talking about in and around Irlam and Cadishead. Starting on the far left with the agriculture of the area and the fustian cutting, when Irlam and Cadishead was little more than agriculture and two small villages nestling on the banks of the Mersey and the Irwell. It was changed by the Irwell and the Mersey becoming a navigation in 1731, and then again when George Stephenson built the railway between Liverpool and Manchester that changed forever the industrialisation of both the northwest and in particular Irlam and Cadishead. When the Mersey and Irwell navigation became the Ship Canal and released vast parcels of land, together with the railways, the industries that you see before you all spawned along its banks, and it became a major industrial area within Lancashire. The Ship Canal Company itself with the coaling basin, the CWS Soap and Candle Works, Royals Engineering, the Builders Company, the Match Company, the Magadia Soda Company, Besto Packaging, and largest of all, the Lancashire Steel Company or the Partington Iron and Steel Works, the Margarine Works, the Wood Works, the Tar Distiller, and more recently the Jubilee Works and the Telecoms Companies, all form part of the industrial powerhouse that Irlam and Cadishead once was, and to the far right still is to this day. So the station is a railway station. It's also a bistro, wine bar and a community hub, but it also forms a small museum to the area, and from time to time you will see the changing of the displays that the Trust put on to actually show the history of the area. Around the station you'll find quite a number of local artefacts. The shovel above the display cabinet was recovered from a railway embankment, which some firemen must have discarded from a locomotive, possibly 100 years ago. The lamps you see on the top of the mantelpiece here, these are signal lamps. They would be taken, in this case, from the North Eastern Railway, and these would have adorned the top of a signal, where a signalman would have climbed a ladder to light the kerosene lamps that would indicate to the firemen and the drivers of the engines the state of the signals as they proceeded down the line. The station is rich with history, and it's not just railway history, although you'll see much of it displayed on the walls, such as the wagon plates behind me, which were all the manufacturers of the wagons that you would have seen in the 18 and 1900s. There's also instruments around the station that you would see in the signal box of that particular era. But upstairs here in the station you'll also see a lot of the industrial history depicted in the various photographs from the different eras around. And whether it's the railways or the industry that was brought to Irlam and Cadishead as a result of the railways, you can find most of it shown here in Irlam Station. So while you're spending time at the station, it's worth walking around the station building and having a look at some of the interesting rooms that we've got. Here we are in the Cheshire Lines committee room, and I'll explain in a short while why we call it the Cheshire Lines committee room. But for now, it's just a really interesting space that I've said tells the industrial and social history of Irlam and Cadishead. But it's quite an interesting room in its own right. And if you look at the overall architecture of the building, it exposes really to people walking around what the building must have felt like when it was constructed in the 1890s. So why the Cheshire Lines room? Well, the Cheshire Lines Committee was formed in 1865 with three major railway companies who wanted to build a railway through from Manchester to Liverpool to take on the mighty London and North West Railway. And they became known as the Cheshire Lines Committee because the first railway they built was actually in Cheshire. So at the time that they were built Irlam Station, which is in Lancashire, it's a little confusing. However, it became known as the Cheshire Lines Committee, and the name stuck right through till nationalisation in 1948. So here's our council clock. It was rescued from the old council offices, which were built in 1907 and demolished in the 1960s when the building started subsiding. It was rescued from an old farm barn and subsequently from the cellar and restored when the station house reopened in 2015. But there's a lot more to the Cheshire Lines room than just the place where we keep the council clock. Here we're able to tell the industrial history and the social history of Irlam and Cadishead. And you see behind me various photographs, in this case of the industrial history. But we've got the soap works and the margarine works, which were two major factories, a major employer in the area back in the early 20th century. And if we just put your attention to the wall here, we also tell the story of the commercial waterways and the railways of Irlam and Cadishead. Because without the railways and the canal, Irlam and Cadishead would never have been the industrial powerhouse that it became. And on the wall here to the other side of me, the history of the steelworks, the Partington Iron and Steelworks, the Lancashire Steel Corporation and latterly British Steel Corporation. And this only came about because the canal cut through the area and provided a big drying floodplain for them able to build the steelworks on and bring in the iron ore, the coal and the limestone necessary for the production of steel. So together with the railways and the canals, we've got this rich industrial history, heavy industry really, that was built up in the early 20th century. And in the room just off to my left, around the corner, we've got lots of displays here that tell more about the social history of Irlam and Cadishead, the highway and the retail and the smaller industries that supported this mass area of employment again in the 20th century. So that concludes our station house tour. But don't forget, this is Irlam Station, this is our station, this is our community station. It's a great place to visit, and of course it's free to come in. It's a good wine bar, we've got a bistro, it's a coffee shop, and there's plenty to look at. So we welcome you down at Irlam Station at any time.